I'd like to use this video to talk about how to find where you've applied joints and also reverse how to find joints you've applied to components. Before we get started, I want to be sure I have two selection filters on, components and joints. Now you can have others on, but I just want to be sure those two are on. So I have a list of joints, quite a few, and I was lazy. I didn't label them all. I labeled two, one that make the gearbox run, but I really want to find out what components are on, let's say this rigid joint. So I highlight it and right click and say select components. It highlights them in a display window. Kind of hard to see, so right click and say isolate at the bottom of the list. Then click in the background. That will bring up only the two components that are related to that joint, the oil seal and the housing. So let's bring everything back. Right click and say unisolate, and let's go back to home. Now the next thing I want to do is go the opposite way. I want to click on the shaft and find out what joints are applied to it. There's more than one probably, but if I right click I can say select referencing joints. Well, there are two highlighted. They're kind of hard to see. One is right there and one is right here. I'm going to pick on this one, and then I'm going to say right click and go down to find in browser, and it opens up right to it. At this point I can right click on and edit it, or I could show components, just what we did before. Right click and say isolate, and then there's my two components. It's that pin and that into the wheel. So let's bring everything back. Right click and say unisolate, and now we're going to do a little something different. If you go over, you have your folder joints expanded. If you click on a component, you'll notice it puts a light blue, kind of a ratchety line underneath the two components that we just found. That's another way to determine which joints are applied to a component. Let's try this one. This has 1, 2, 3, 4 joints applied to that component. Let's just click on this oil seal inside here. There's only one joint, a rigid joint. So that's another way to determine which joints are applied to different components. Now you notice I've been using the isolate and unisolate command. You can also use the hide and the show all command too if you want to instead. Let's just click on this rigid joint, right click and say select components. Right click on the screen and hit hide show, then click in the background. You see it turned those off. I can see up inside it. Now to bring them all back, you have to right click on the top level and say show all components. So it's up to you which one you use, but I find isolate much easier. Let's try isolate again. So I'm going to select all components. Select all components. Right click on the screen and say isolate at the very bottom. Click in the background. There you go. This is the bushing and the drive wheel. Now let's bring them all back with unisolate. I find that much easier than hide and unhide. I've been working from the browser in my joints folder, but you could do it from the graphic screen. If you turn on all your joints, you'll see all the little joint symbols. They're kind of hard to determine what they go to, but if you recognize that most of them are rigid, there's the one revolve right there. But you can actually do the same process from here. So if I pick on this joint, right click and say find in browser, it'll find it directly for me. So you can do it that way too. At that point you can right click and say select components, and then you could, I have to do that again, a little hasty, and you could isolate. You could turn off your joints and you could work on. So let's go unisolate again, and let's talk about one more thing in another model. In this model we have a joint that rotates this. It is a revolve joint right there, and if you move this thing and you say, well gee whiz, where was it? Well, there's a home position. So if you right click on that, you'll see it has two options. Go to home position, will put it right back where it was. This is a home position. Let's say you want to change that to it vertical to this face and that face vertical or horizontal to each other. So I go down here and hit align, pick on this face and pick on that face, and they'll align. Say OK. Come over to that joint, and this time, instead of go to home position, set the home position. Then if you mess it up, it'll go back to that one. Another good use of joints, right click. So go to home, goes now vertical. So you can set it anywhere you want. You can set it there and make that the home position. It's up to you. Then if you mess it up, you can set it back to home very quickly. So just one more use of the right click on the joints folder. Hope this helps.